Everyone, I am going to take a look at this question here. Consider how the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, one other poet you've studied, depicts the lives of workers in their poems. Percy Bysshe Shelley, he was a member of the elite. He got thrown out of Oxford for writing a treatise against God. So he was a kind of revolutionary figure, not someone who is afraid to court controversy and challenge the power systems inherent within British society at the time he's writing, which is shortly after the French Revolution. So there was the idea of like revolution was in the air, uprisings of working class people against the bourgeoisie or the industrialists or the aristocracy. So he's writing within that kind of context, and there were revolutions and uprisings within Britain at the time, so such as the St. Peterloo massacre. We don't have to include all of that information. We don't have time in a timed piece like this. But that's useful background to know that when he is speaking about the working class, he's really trying to celebrate them. It's a call to action. It's as if he's giving a speech to give them strength, to give them the power to rise up against their oppressors. That's different, very different to my second poem. I chose Shelley and Tuwhare's monologue. He's a New Zealand contemporary poet, worked in a factory himself, so I think that helped to build this empathetic voice. He's actually someone who's from amongst the ranks of the working class, and I think his themes are often about socialist themes. He writes with colloquial voices about regular people rather than writing about kings and queens. So two different contexts, but both about working class people. In this table, I've just identified what I think are some of the very regular ideas that you'll see and experience within poetry. So you could have these as a kind of working framework when you're deconstructing any of the poems or going across and revising them. Now the thing about poetry, it's like a painting by Picasso or a chord played by Tchaikovsky as part of a symphony. Some of these things they don't operate in isolation. It's the contribution of many elements working together. But we know we've got a timed essay response to write. It's useful then to be able to put things together in some kind of structure, and maybe picking some of these key elements that you think are the most important things about those particular poems is a good way to approach it. Now, as you'll see here, I've chosen, after my introduction, to look at the voice, the speaker, themes and ideas, structural elements, which I think is a good one, because if you're looking at poetry, it's not just about the correct words or the best choice of words, it's about how they are placed upon the page, and getting into things like lineation, stanza construction, the use of caesura, rhyme scheme as well. These are rhyme scheme or its absence. What is it? Free verse. These are things which are going to help you talk about the technical aspects of poetry. So I like to include that there as well. And with all of these, I've just reminded myself that I've always got to not just describe or summarise and state what's there. I've got to be able to talk about the intention, the meaning, the effects of the writer's use of these devices. Next, I'll look at the tonal shifts. Now, very possibly I should also look at like the imagery. There's a lot to say about language there. If I have time, maybe I can say that I'll consider imagery, metaphor and symbolism. But I'll have to take a look at if I've got time to do that. I've got to be pragmatic because I know I've only got an hour and 15 minutes, I think, for the exam. And I can drive towards a conclusion then, maybe a personal response, try to evaluate which was the most effective poem or the poem that I enjoyed the most. Okay, so there's a framework for writing. As we get into the poems, these are hyperlinked at the top of this document. These are hyperlinked to this poetry context document. That maybe helps just to see the kind of evolution of where these writers are coming from, and a little bit about their background. And if you were to click on these, then you've got very detailed sets of notes, which are kind of useful for getting to grips with the poem as they are. But because I want to do something that's comparative, I will take this on again in a different form. I'm going to colour code these for the purposes of communicating this as clearly as possible to you watching on YouTube or wherever you are. So there's my first point. The voice, the themes and ideas is blue, structural elements, green, tonal shifts, pink, and Song to the Men of England. It's probably a good time now to pause the recording if you haven't already and just read through Song to the Men of England again, so you refamiliarise yourself with the poem and the themes and ideas, and then you can unpause and I'll begin the deconstruction. So here, if I characterise voice, immediately we have this arresting, powerful, direct address. It's the poet possibly adopting the tone of a revolutionary leader, an agitator, someone who's speaking perhaps on the factory floor to a group of men. This is before communism really emerged in the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, you started to have the acorns of communism, but socialism, an idea of protecting the working class and protecting the rights of workers, because at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but there's huge inequalities of those who control the farms, and that tends to be the landowners who by birthright are given the land. It's passed down through the generations, so it's the nobility that's being attacked here. It's the structure of the construction of power. So that's with the Industrial Revolution. It's the factory owners, the industrialists as well. Now, the men who plough are those who work in the fields, but there's also lots of references here to the chain and the scourge and the forge. These are the fires where the smelting of the iron to create the steel and the industry within this age. So he speaks directly here, forcefully, in an inspiring way as a leader to the men of England. Weave robes, let not the idle wear. Here you could see, of course, this is structural elements as well. It's the voice being created through the use of hyphenated phrases, which it sets up this idea of look at what you do and look at the reality of what's happening. You're weaving the robes, the idle are wearing them. You're forging arms in your defence to bear. That's how it should be. So they're saying, let no tyrant reap, using lots of modal commands in this powerful commanding voice, and using the separation of the situation with the reality of how it should be. That kind of parallel structure is there throughout the whole of this. So that's structural elements and tone as well. I've identified themes and ideas in blue. Till fair England be your sepulchre. Well, there's a lot happening in the conclusion, and as a kind of like health check, you imagine a doctor with a stethoscope, listening to your circulation and your heartbeat, and they put the stethoscope under your heart, but then they'll also put it like down towards your stomach, and then they'll ask you to turn around and put it on your back, and then listen again, deep breaths. So it's good to see what the poet is doing. Certainly, a lot of thought will be given to the introductory moments and to the conclusion, and you can track the tonal shifts throughout the poem, which helps you to identify the themes and ideas anyway. And I think there's some very distinct tonal shifts here. At the beginning, the voice is angry, accusative, very, very supportive. Here there's a shift to see how contemptuous that they are of the ungrateful drones who drink your blood, so depicting them in a kind of vampiric way. That would be some good imagery there, some good metaphor. Maybe I do need another paragraph to cover that. There is a lot of metaphorical language here. The bees of England are like the workers. The bee is the symbol of Manchester, because Manchester is one of the great industrial cities. The coal barge is on both Manchester United and Manchester City's badges. So there's this eviscerating tone of condemnation, asking people to rise up, and then there's this tone here. He takes a different tone in the middle. The seed ye sow, another reaps. The wealth ye find, another keeps. The robes ye weave, another wears. The arms ye forge, another bears. You can feel the rhythm there is kind of marching out the sense of the injustice, and the use of caesura, the comma that breaks up these parallel phrases within the line, really gives you a sense of the opposite thing. It's like black and white, justice and exploitation laid out very clearly in oppositional ways within this construction of this poem. So there's some thoughts and ideas here, and what I would do is I'd extract these, because I definitely want some pertinent examples to work with, and I can start to fill out my table here. And then always making sure that I have a comment on the effect of these elements. The same thing has happened here. Monologue by Shelley and Tuwhare. I've highlighted the voice in red, themes and ideas in blue, structural elements in green, tonal shifts in pink. I think here we've got a much more laconic voice. He's kind of like humble and very empathetic in that sense, but also quite cynical, quite world weary. This is someone who's worked in quite a tough situation for long, and the fact they like to live working by a door, they seem, to be honest, to be quite boring initially. But it's only as you get a sense of who this guy is that he's actually a very close observer of human relationships. He's actually more intelligent than we might at first give him credit for. And so Shelley and Tuwhare here is really asking us as a reader to listen to this man, someone who maybe doesn't often have the confidence to speak because they're quiet and they're withdrawn. But if you choose to listen carefully, you'll actually see someone with an interesting worldview, someone who's prepared to work hard, someone who understands the kind of injustices that he sees, because he chooses to work near the big doors, to be furthest away from the bosses who come down to shout instructions in my ear. So there's quite a strong parallel here, I think, to the idea of the working class being the hero of this poem, similarly to Song to the Men of England. And we see a kind, a compassionate person. Maybe the structure of these stanzas is very similar, because the work, the 9 to 5, the production line is very similar as well. So this doesn't really have the kinds of shifts in tone and variation that you might see in Song to the Men of England. Yet I do think that there's this really significant shift within the middle of the poem where they talk quite philosophically really about the nature of life and working to make ends meet, and so here I think you're looking at someone who's really like maybe towards, I get the sense of a voice of someone towards the end of their career. He's worked there for 15 months, but he's probably, maybe had to move from job to job just to go where the work is, and it's tough, it's a slog. So I think you get this kind of weariness within the voice there. And in the end, maybe that's alienated him to the point that he's adopted this kind of panicked or catastrophic worldview that earthquakes, of course, do happen in New Zealand. It's very earthquake zones, but then the final idea within this poem, it seems to be like quite catastrophizing as well. So maybe underneath this calmer voice, you do have someone who's panicked and anxious and stressed, and maybe that because of a series of the conditions of the economic situation that he finds himself within, which is another parallel back to the Song to the Men of England. Okay, so I'll leave that there.